Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight's going to be a great opportunity to build our strength together in these uncertain times. Please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's joining us, and we will begin momentarily. This forum is intended to be participatory, so it needs your participation. We want to hear from you and what you think, and while you're listening, please put any questions or thoughts you have in the chat. I'm Lily Reed. I'm an education reporter and guild leader out of the Baltimore Sun. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Michelle Merlin. I'm a reporter at the Morning Call out in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and a guild leader there as well. And we're really excited to be moderating this discussion tonight. We're here because Tribune Publishing, the owners of newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, the Morning Call, the Hartford Courant, and many more, is facing its biggest adversary, corporate greed incarnate in the form of predatory hedge fund Alden Global Capital. This isn't new. Alden first purchased stock in November 2019 when it became Tribune's largest shareholder. This hedge fund has built a reputation as the destroyer of newspapers based on a brutal history of staff cuts at the roughly 200 publications it owns under Alden's Digital First Media News Group.
Alden now has the opportunity to buy more power next summer. At Alden-controlled newspapers, staff cuts have frequently exceeded 70%. Tribune's newspapers are in for a gutting, and that means local communities are too. The Tribune units have banded together to form a Save Local News campaign that is seeking to push Alden out and invite local community-minded investors in. It would be a complicated maneuver given Alden's tight grip on power, but we are here tonight to talk about what that would look like and how you can help. We will delve into the origins of this existential threat and some personal experiences about how it's played out to the detriment of local communities, a model solution we're trying to employ, and next steps. So let's let our panelists introduce themselves. First, we have Michael Kink.
I'm Michael Kink, Executive Director of the Strong Economy for All Coalition, a labor community coalition in New York and nationwide, and one of the co-founders of the Hedge Clippers, an activist group that's exposing the operations of hedge funds and private equity funds and the billionaire class as they destroy jobs, explode inequality, and use money and power to rig the system to benefit themselves.
Next up, we have Charles Kahn.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Kahn. I work alongside Michael, another co-founder of the Hedge Clippers, and the organizing director at the Strong Economy for All Coalition in New York.
Tonight, we also have joining us Evan Brandt.
I'm a reporter with the Mercury newspaper in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, and I'm here to tell you what life is like on the other side. I've worked at the Mercury since 1997 and have been working under Alden Global Capital's ownership for about 5 of those years, and I'm here to tell you what they do to local newspapers.
We also have joining us Stephen Waldman. Oh, looks like we're having a little technical trouble. Steve is the co-founder of Report for America and author of the landmark FCC report, The Information Needs of Communities, which looked recently at the state of the news industry at the start of a steep decline that continues today. More recently, Waldman has advanced the idea of replanting American journalism with a combination of philanthropic and public policy support. Just today, he was part of a group to launch Rebuild Local News at rebuildlocalnews.org with specific policy ideas, some of which we at the News Guild have endorsed to replant local journalism.
Next up, we have Julie Reynolds.
Hey, everyone. So I'm Julie Reynolds. I am a freelance investigative reporter. I have been called the indefatigable I don't even know how to pronounce that. Alden Sleuth by Vanity Fair, which is a title I bear very proudly. So I've been investigating Alden Global Capital almost exclusively for the past 4 years. You've seen some of my reporting probably in The Nation, did some stories for Newsweek, The Intercept, and you can read almost all of, scores and scores of Alden stories at dfmworkers.org, which is a News Guild website. And that's where a lot of my work is published. And I will continue investigating Alden for the foreseeable future.
Great. And next up, we have Susana Mendoza.
Hi, everyone. I'm Illinois State Controller Susana Mendoza. I'm the state's Chief Fiscal and Accountability Officer, and I've certainly been on the receiving end of good press and bad press, but I love a free press. So that's why I'm here today. I think it's really important that we do what we can to save local news.
Yeah. So as everyone can tell, we have a lot of knowledge on this call right now. So please drop your thoughts and questions in the chat of whatever platform you're on, and we'll see if we can get to them.
So let's get started talking about the threat to our industry, which is Alden. Susana, you've had plenty of interactions with the press. You said good and bad as a state legislator. You've been very public about voicing your concerns about Alden's ownership weakening the Chicago Tribune. As a public official, why are you concerned about what's happening?
Sure, because I care about a free press and democracy. First of all, let me just start by saying hi to everybody. Those of you that are serving on the panel today, but also those that are, checking in to see what we're talking about. This is really important stuff. These are super tough times to be a journalist. And many of you have had to take furloughs since the hedge fund profiteers took over the Tribune Company. Some of you have been roughed up at protests. The president has a habit of calling you, all of you, I should say, an enemy of the people. And the folks at the Capital Gazette, no one's been through what you've been through. A primary focus of what I do and what I talk about since taking office is transparency, because I really believe it's the pathway to restoring trust in government. And on our website, for example, we post all the ways that the state of Illinois is spending taxpayer dollars so that taxpayers can see it, so that reporters like you can actually analyze it. And if you happen to see a contract that looks suspicious, you can actually raise the red flag and start investigating. Newspapers around the country, in Pittsburgh, in Tampa, Seattle, they've editorialized that my COVID-19 spending portal, which is on our website, showing how Illinois has spent every penny of federal CARES Act money, is a national model that other states should follow. And obviously, while that coverage was great, you're right. I haven't always gotten good coverage. But look, we all know that it's your job to ask us elected officials the uncomfortable questions. And I definitely have built up a thick skin. I can take it. Scrutiny is part of the deal when you run for public office. But I'd be lying to you if I didn't admit that I have used the Trib from time to time, certain writers' columns specifically, to line my mother's birdcage. Don't hold it against me. But I'm just saying that because when I was in Chicago this summer speaking at a Save the News rally, I said, and I never thought I would, that I couldn't believe I was standing at an event fighting to actually save the Chicago Tribune. But that's where we're at. Our founding fathers were right when they singled out the press for special protection in the Constitution. That matters. And I'll tell you what, I would much rather suffer an occasionally unfairly harsh story than live in a world without a free and robust press, especially when it comes to the local press, because it's the local reporting that time and again has exposed the horrors of things like rapes and assaults in nursing homes and in the Chicago public schools, of political corruption that needs to be rooted out at all levels, of violence in our streets and the devastation that comes from it, and the brutal and heavy-handed response of a president who calls the press, quote, scumbags who should be executed. A president who would love nothing more than to see newsrooms be dismantled piece by piece, reporter by reporter. When I wake up every morning, there's two papers that I read. They're my local papers, the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune, and I count on them to tell me what's going on. And oftentimes their coverage has truly motivated me and many other elected officials to take corrective action. The stories, they spurred legislation that has led to safeguarding seniors and children, to making our workplaces safer and less discriminatory, to diminishing the disparities in healthcare. How about the stories about COVID-19 showing that Black and brown communities have been decimated, especially here in Chicago? Those stories are going to lead to fundamental change because they're not just stories. They're the spark that starts a fire that illuminates the truth and inspires those of us in positions of influence to actually do something to fix things. I've traveled the state of Illinois over the years, talking to editorial boards from Belleville to Peoria, seeking their moral firepower to help pass reforms in state government. But today, many of those commentary sections are dying or already gone. I care about that. Some of those newspapers have suffered such draconian cutbacks that they're not even doing editorials anymore. Those are local voices being silenced. We need local journalism. We need local journalists empowered to actually do their jobs. And while hedge fund investors are amassing obscene personal wealth by acquiring struggling local newsrooms and stripping them of all of their talent and assets, we the people, we suffer right along with those journalists. We're seeing it right here in Chicago and with the Chicago Tribune. Alden Global Capital, or better yet, as Vanity Fair calls them, the hedge fund vampire that bleeds newspapers dry, is doing their very best to suck the life out of journalism here in Chicago. Their expertise is plundering and pillaging. They gut newsrooms and they prey on American newspapers at the expense of a free and robust press. Let's not make any mistake about this. These guys are sucking the life out of democracy, newsroom by newsroom, reporter by reporter. And it's not just an attack on journalists, but an attack on all of us. So when you silence the truth and prevent it from shining, you darken democracy. Every American who believes in a free and robust press should care about this war on democracy and realize that this is a fight worth fighting. It's why when you asked me to join this call tonight, I was happy to do so, because it's important that we stand up to these hedge fund vampires, especially now at Halloween. So let me just close. I know I've said a lot, but I'll remind investors. It's important to remind investors, philanthropists, civic boosters, people who care about Chicago, who care about democracy, that it's never too late to step up to the plate and invest in local news so that these reporters can keep doing their most important work. I really hope they do that. Thank you for asking me to participate, and I'll answer other questions. They won't be so long, I promise. But most important thing is you guys keep up the good fight. I'm happy to stand with you, not just today, but whenever you need me.
Thanks so much, Susanna. I really relate to what you said about local news stories are the spark that starts the fire, and I think our communities can feel these cuts just as deeply. So I want to direct our next question to Julie. Julie, could you take us back to when you started investigating the hedge fund 4 years ago? How did you get into this work, and what did the public know about hedge funds like Alden at the time? How did you uncover some of the most insidious parts of their business model? Looks like we're still having technical troubles. Oop, there she goes. Julie, were you able to hear my question?
Hi, am I live?
Yes, you are live. So could you take us back and
yes,
tell us?
I did. Okay, great. My this very moment. Yes, can you hear me okay? I have trouble right now.
We can hear you now.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So I got involved in the January of 2016. I had worked at a Knight Ridder newspaper, which was an awesome place to work at the time, and it got taken over eventually by Alden Global Capital. I left the Monterey Herald in 2015, and in January 2016, the News Guild had started up a DFM caucus. It was a caucus of DFM newspapers that were all members of the News Guild. And they were launching a little website to try to keep everyone connected and communicating. And I was asked if I would edit that website. Well, Darren Carroll of the News Guild started brainstorming with me, and we started thinking, you know, you're an investigative reporter. Why don't we put
Oop, we're still having trouble, Julie. Let's see if she comes back. Sorry, folks, we're having technical difficulties.
That's too bad. I really love reading her stuff on DFM workers.
I know, I follow Julie all the time for sure. Okay, well, we might just move on to our next folks, Michael and Charles. Let's dig more into that business model. What is it and why did Alden decide to apply it to the news industry?
Yeah, so the thing about Alden Capital's business model is that it's actually pretty common among hedge funds and private equity for that matter. And essentially what they do is they look for companies that have valuable assets, right? Companies that have a lot of real estate, companies that have a lot of subscribers, or companies where they feel like they could lay off a significant portion of the workers and kind of pocket whatever is left over. And ultimately, that's what their goal is, to pocket as much of the value from the companies as they can. And so what Alden Capital has done to hundreds of newspapers is essentially that, strip mining, right? They purchase a paper, sometimes out of bankruptcy, sometimes from a previous owner, and methodically they take the paper to the chop shop, right? They start to lay off folks in the newsrooms. You could see at papers owned by Alden Capital that the downsizing is twice that of other newspapers, right? And so they lay off folks. We heard from Susanna that you start to lose particular important pieces of the news because that's no longer someone's beat. Someone isn't covering it anymore. And then they also will often sell the property, sell the newsroom, sell the office space. I know that the Denver Post was one particular place where people saw them sell the office to a company that was also owned by Alden Capital. And then the newspaper had to lease the space back from Alden Capital. And then the last thing they do is they charge kind of exorbitant fees, both to the people that invest in Alden Capital, but then also to the companies that they control, right? And they find a way to essentially seek fees at every corner from these companies, and then leave the carcass behind. They've been known as a vulture hedge fund for a long, long time before they turned their eye to newspapers, and it's part of a much, much bigger and broader problem that I think the public, even if they're outside of newsrooms, workers at large, have really been trying to tackle, because it seems like everywhere hedge funds go, disaster follows.
And the two things I would add is, one, a lot of this is accomplished with other people's money. They get money from pension funds. They use huge amounts of borrowed money, debt, so that the kind of smash and grab is accomplished with other people's money as the cash. So they pull out fees, they pull out profits, they benefit from running the company into the ground, and they do not provide a good return to their investors. As Charles mentioned, the fees are so extraordinarily high that at most hedge funds, they outweigh any kind of profits that are distributed to the investors. So I think other people's money is an important part of this. and being a bad deal for investors, including pension funds, including state controllers like Controller Mendoza. Alden's business model is great for the hedge fund managers and pretty much bad for everybody else.
I think we have Julie back with us. We might bring her back just to answer that question since she got cut off before. Julie, are you with us?
I am here. Thank you so much for your patience.
Sure.
The power went out in the entire house, but it's back. So, when you guys actually covered a lot of the basics of what Alden is doing. When I first started.
Looks like we lost her again. I'm sorry, folks. I think we might have to move on.
All right. Well, I guess we'll start with Evan Brandt, my fellow Pennsylvania journalist.
Go Keystone State.
Yeah, woo.
I'm a Pennsylvania native too, so woo.
Uh-oh. So Evan, Alden assumed control over your newspaper back in 2011 when it went under one of its former aliases, Digital First Media, which I think a lot of us on this call probably remember. I understand even before that, the owners weren't so great for local journalism. Can you tell us about the state of things when you started at the Mercury in 1997 and the various forces that brought it to its current diminished state, where you're the only reporter and you don't have an office?
So greetings from my attic. I started in 1997, and at the time there were 14 reporters in the newsroom as well as some sports staff. Very shortly after I started, the newspaper was purchased by a now defunct newspaper company called the Journal Register Corporation, which also had a very fearsome reputation for cost cutting, and they began doing it immediately. So over almost the entire course of the more than 20 years I've worked for the Mercury, it's become a pretty regular thing for staff to be reduced. And this was a regular newspaper company. So this was before hedge funds got involved. And as anyone who's following this knows, newspapers did a lot of damage to themselves before the conditions that we're talking about today came about. They didn't adapt very well to the internet. When Google and Facebook started stealing all the ads, they didn't really have an answer for it. When Craigslist stole all of their classified advertising, they didn't really have an answer for it. And so they weren't in terribly good condition to begin with, which I think is what brought them to the attention of a hedge fund like Alden Global Capital, which specializes in sort of wounded animal assets. And so when they took, what happened was Journal Register went through several bankruptcies, and in one of those bankruptcies, it emerged as Digital First Media. And I had a CEO named John Payton who tried for a while to figure out how you make newspapers work and make money. A lot of people think of newspapers and the media as businesses, but they forget that when the country was founded, they were businesses because they needed to be independent of the government. But they provide a public service like other government services. It's like the post office. It's like the police. They provide things that the country needs, that democracy needs, in order to be healthy. But they needed to be independent of the government, and so the only way to really do that at the time was to become a business, so you made your own money. And as the corporations began to get involved, the money making became more important than the public service aspect of journalism, and that's sort of where the root of all this begins. And Alden becomes just the most extreme example of it. They're Wall Street sharks, and so we shouldn't be surprised that sharks consume everything in front of them. So what that's meant in real time here in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. It's a post-industrial town of about 23,000, and it's had a newspaper for about 80 years, a very vibrant local newspaper. And it's been winnowed year by year, quarter by quarter. What mostly happens either is that people get laid off, or when they leave, they're not replaced. That's the most common, attrition is the most common way that we get rid of staff. And then exactly like Michael and Charles said, when Alden came in and took control of Digital First Media, the first thing they did is they sold the building to themselves. They sold it to a holding company, which then began to charge rent. It's one of the ways that they extract wealth and value from the company. They didn't maintain the building. We had a leaking roof. We had potted plants around to catch the water on rainy days. And eventually they closed the building and they sold it. And we all now work out of our houses. And I've gone from covering the town and the school district of Pottstown to trying to keep track of roughly 30 different municipalities. That includes school districts, and on local election years, not this year, but next year, I try and keep track of as many as 50. And obviously things get missed. And that's not the way that local journalism is supposed to serve democracy, and it's not happening. And to a certain extent, it's happening because Alden Global Capital is more interested in making money than they are in providing the public service that local news is.
Wow, so I don't know if I should scream or cry or what while you describe that. Maybe our next guest could give me something else to do. Stephen Waldman, who I think is here now. Yes, he is. So, your strategy of replanting sounds a lot like a lot of the concepts that our grassroots Save Local News campaign is going for. What are kind of some basic outlines of this strategy, and does it seem feasible in the context of Tribune?
So the basic idea is that as a country, we shouldn't just accept the idea that there are hundreds of newspapers that are stranded inside chains or financial institutions, and we can't just keep shrugging and saying, well, we have to just let that play out, and then maybe start some new news organizations. Though those are good too. So the idea is that we need a strategy for replanting newspapers that are held by private equity funds, hedge funds, and other chains into community groups. And that could be a community foundation, a new nonprofit organization, a public radio station, anything that is community grounded, even a public benefit corporation, something that's community grounded, or it could be a labor union for that matter, as I've mentioned in the past. And the idea would be to have these newspapers in effect replanted. To torture the metaphor a little bit, we know that sometimes plants that are dying because they're in toxic soil, if you pull them out of that soil and put them in healthy soil and give them some fertilizer, they can do well. So how do you achieve this? Now you're doing it. You're attempting to do this, in real time, in a very challenging way. And I don't know that I have a whole lot to offer you to help you directly with that. But what I'm suggesting is that we need new public policies that would make it easier for you to do what you're doing, and would just make it more likely that these things would be replanted. And we look at it from a kind of a mix of carrots and sticks. The sticks are that in antitrust law, so the U.S. Justice Department or the Federal Trade Commission, they ought to be taking into consideration the term localism, which basically means, is this merger going to hurt the community? Like, don't only look at it in terms of whether it makes financial sense for the company or whether it's going to affect prices or something like that. Is it going to harm the community? Or, for instance, there's, we have plant closing laws that have been on the books for a while that say if you're shutting down a factory, you have to notify the workers ahead of time. Well, what about a newspaper closing law that essentially gives not only the workers, but the community advance notice so that they have time to organize and to potentially try to acquire a newspaper? I also think there should be some carrots too. This might be more controversial, but I think it would be worth it in the long run to have tax incentives so that, for instance, if a chain were to donate a newspaper to a nonprofit organization instead of shutting it, that they could get a charitable deduction for that. Or that if they were going to sell it to a nonprofit or to a union or a community group, that could be a tax-free transaction. I know that does put a little extra, money into their hands, but I feel like it's a one-time hit that would extract, the newspapers from them, and it would be well worth it if we can get these papers replanted into community organizations that would really help them thrive. Now, my day job is I run Report for America, which is a national service program that puts reporters into local newsrooms. But I'm also involved, I'm a coordinator of something called the Rebuild Local News Coalition, rebuildlocalnews.org. And we have come up with it's a kind of an association of groups that represent local news organizations, nonprofit news organizations, weeklies, Black newspapers, Hispanic publications, really about 3,000 or 4,000 different local newsrooms. And we've put forth a plan of government policy that would help local news in a variety of ways, one of which is the replanting strategy. But we also have other ways that we think that the government can help with local news, which I can elaborate on if that's of interest. But in terms of this topic, we think that time is of the essence. Like we've got to, as bad as things are now, I think it's about to get worse. That COVID has, worsened the economic status of a lot of newspapers. I wouldn't be surprised to see more acquisitions by hedge funds or more mergers or more bankruptcies, and that we need to get together and really create a strategy, probably create a new entity that would help to fund replantings and be ready quickly, because it's going to get worse, and we don't want this period of American history to happen where we stand helplessly by as thousands and thousands of community newspapers are bled or shut.
Wow. I wonder, how did you get into this kind of work?
Well, I was a journalist ages ago for Newsweek magazine and U.S. News and World Report and some local papers. And then I as a reporting project, actually for Newsweek, I did a big project about AmeriCorps, about the creation of the AmeriCorps program, the National Service Program. And I kind of became smitten with that, and I went to work for AmeriCorps and became very, very steeped in the world of national and community service programs. And eventually I went back to journalism and became a reporter again. But starting at about 2010, when I started to see, as everyone else did, that the internet disruption was starting to really devastate local news, I started to think, I wonder if there is a way that us journalism types could learn from the national and community service people that had created AmeriCorps, and that led to the creation of Report for America. And I also worked at during that time for the Federal Communications Commission, which, it actually doesn't have that much to do with newspapers in America. It has a little bit, but it has a lot to do with local TV news. And that gave me just this incredible education when I was working at the FCC about how government policy can really influence the way that media operates and whether local news is healthy or not, in all sorts of ways that people really aren't aware of. It's kind of arcane stuff sometimes. The policy and regulatory issues is kind of complex, and people don't pay much attention to it. But it really has a profound influence on the topics that we're talking about tonight.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I'd like to direct some questions towards Mike and Charles again. We actually have a question from Bill Amira, who asks, now that consumers are so used to getting news on the internet for free, is it too late to ask for community investment?
Well, I think one of the important ways to demonstrate the need for community investment is to demonstrate the fact that companies like Alden aren't doing any investment at all. The work that the News Guild has been doing to document the destruction of jobs in local journalism, and the work that reporters and press workers and newspaper people of all kinds are doing to fight back is super important. Hedge Clippers has taken an admittedly kind of more pugnacious perspective than the more productive grow it back approach that Stephen was talking about. But sometimes, getting into a fight shows a community what the stakes are. We always work with organized people, with unions, with community groups, with organized students and tenants. You got to get a crew together to have a fight. And it's clear that the News Guild and allies have that here. We do reports. And again, I don't have to tell journalists the value of having basic information that's shared by the community so that you can go into a fight equipped and ready to fight. We never do a report without a direct action. If we put out a report, we're going to be at someone's office or someone's home or someone's luxury retreat in the Hamptons, like you guys have done with Heath Freeman and Montauk. We're going to combine it with labor action. So if there are strikes, if there's pressure campaigns, if there are rent strikes by tenants, if there are legislative actions that groups want to take. Reasonable, productive things like tax breaks for newspapers that have been donated. More aggressive things like flat out barring private equity and hedge funds from owning newspapers. Right? They're doing that in California on housing. They're saying in response to this housing crisis, private equity and hedge funds should not be allowed to speculate and try to make huge profits off of basic public goods like housing. And I would argue that journalism is in the same perspective. Divestment out of hedge funds is another important tool we've used. We've run campaigns where we've gotten city, state, local controllers, private pension funds to divest billions of dollars out of hedge funds because they're a bad investment and because they hurt their communities. The name and shame aspect of this is important. Being in their communities, being at their fancy apartments, being at their luxury compounds. The Hedge Clippers campaign went out to the Hamptons 3 separate times this summer, literally with pitchforks, to fight for higher taxes on billionaires and fair treatment for communities. So that kind of atmosphere around the destruction of journalism by hedge funds, I think can make it clear to the public that there's a chance for things like community ownership, things like community investment that'd be better than what you've got right now.
So we have a follow-up question for you gentlemen from a concerned reader in Virginia. Do you feel there's an appetite among federal lawmakers to use those antitrust laws or writing new ones to break up companies like Tribune Publishing?
Yeah, so I think the federal appetite for antitrust is dictated by the public. I think we saw, yesterday that they're now using antitrust laws to go after Google, right? When they could have gone after Facebook or they could have gone after Amazon. And so we have a lot of power to be able to set the agenda. I know that there are smart, capable people like Rohit Chopra, like others in government who want to use these antitrust laws to break up monopolies and companies that are too big, that are ultimately not serving the public. And so Yes, I do think that the federal government, we can create an appetite for them to do that. I also think, to follow the plant metaphor, I think government, both state and federal, could has a role to play in putting together the seed funding that would help to replant some of these papers. And so we do have a lot of tools to fight hedge funds, really like public goods, and the biggest tool being government. And so I do think that is an option that we have to follow and explore.
Steve, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, on a national level, of course, it'll depend a little bit on what happens with the election. That may determine a lot, but I have noticed that it's actually a fairly bipartisan sentiment, the hostility to hedge funds, in terms of what they're doing to newspapers. I don't know if it's true for other aspects of hedge fund work, but it surprised me a little bit that there is a recognition among senators and congressmen of both parties that this is a destructive fact. So I actually think that there is a moment right now, especially if either the Senate or the White House changes, where for the first time in ages, there's actually going to be some focus on this topic of how policy can help local news. And I think there'd actually be a lot of interest in tackling this part of the problem.
I think that sounds really exciting. That's good news for all of us. I want to try to bring in Julie one more time if she's available. Julie's based in California. I know there have been some blackouts. So let's see. Julie, are you able to join us or share maybe just your audio?
Using audio.
Oh, there we go.
Working all right?
All right, so I have a question for you. I know that a lot of your work has appeared on the DFM Workers site, which was a project of the News Guild, where it was also part of a campaign to win fair contracts for workers at Digital First Media's 13 bargaining units. Have you gotten any concessions, and are there reasons to keep the pressure on and keep Alden's reputation in the limelight?
Absolutely. I think what Steve just said actually speaks to some of the accomplishments of the campaign in terms of legislators and even the general public, even journalists, understanding what hedge funds are doing. This campaign, I think, single-handedly changed the paradigm. We're talking 4 short years. It was originally created just to try to get better concessions on the next contracts. It turns out it was originally 12 units. They were all expiring at the same time. And so people thought it was a good idea to get together and negotiate jointly. Well, it turned into this much bigger thing once we started using it as a tool to apply investigative reporting to Alden and to the problem in general. So several things were accomplished. All of the bargaining units involved were able to negotiate jointly. They were able to get a 3% raise after many of these newspapers had no raises in 10 years. So that was a huge concession right there. Individually, I've seen union DFM papers compared to non-union DFM papers in my community. They've gotten better medical care. They've gotten better vacation. These may seem like small things, but they have been able to accomplish some wins for their members. But I think the most important thing is this coalition has been able to change the paradigm, as I said. When I started reporting on this, I didn't really know what a hedge fund was. I certainly didn't know that there was a phenomenon of hedge funds taking over newspapers. It was starting to get reported at Poynter, and some academic researchers were looking at it, but I don't think most of us understood or knew how grave the problem was. And I think, single-handedly, this campaign has educated people to the fact that you can't Google Alden anymore without seeing something about destroying newspapers right next to their name. The reason the Washington Post has covered this, the reason the New York Times has covered this, and NPR and everyone else, is because this coalition was able to get together, get these facts out. And, I did a lot of reporting, but the coalition itself supported and helped me with information too. The kinds of facts that led to finding out that Alden had basically taken its workers' pension money, its pensions funds, and invested it in its own fund in the Cayman Islands. Well, that was the coalition itself had uncovered that fact. And then, I was able to write about it. The coalition itself did the research to prove that Alden had been laying off staff, at twice the national rate. Now we're almost 3 times the national rate. The coalition of those original newspapers went from almost 1,000 members when I started in early 2016 to fewer than 400 now. So it's been very dramatic and drastic what Alden has done. And yet this small group of people has been able to make a huge difference. And I very much agree with the other speakers that this is the time now. This next year is going to be critical. COVID has put a huge dent in local news, but it has also proven how important it is and how much people need it. I'm really inspired to hear people like Susanna talk about this as a resource to be treasured and to be protected. So I think the campaign itself is continuing. I would love to see Tribune workers doing some of the same kind of work. And this is a perfect example of what's going on right here tonight. So I think, it's time for more workers to get involved. Journalists have been very reluctant to stand up for themselves and investigate their own companies. And now it's time, for journalists to kind of investigate their own industry and tell the story and tell the truth. We have a lot more power, I think, than we realize. There are numerous legislators and lawmakers now who are very interested in this. That's because of the work of the coalition.
I feel like that really speaks to our collective power that we have, that despite all the cuts, working together is really the way to go to, move the needle on this thing. And they've clearly demonstrated that they care a lot about public opinion. So yeah, the more noise we can make, the better. Thank you for your work on that. Next, I think we have a short video that we're going to show everyone.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's an honor to serve you in the United States Senate. Thank you to all of the News Guild and Communication Workers of America members for having me today. Thank you for all those watching, for the work you do for journalism and for your communities. You all know how important local newspapers are to their communities and equally, maybe more importantly, to our functioning democracy. All over the country, we see local newspapers close their doors or barely stay open with all too hollowed out newsrooms. Last year, we lost the Vindicator in Youngstown, Ohio, a family-owned paper for 132 years. It had served the community. We've seen Wall Street hedge funds like Alden Capital gobbling up local papers across the country, only to then, as hedge funds do, gut their employees, gut their newsrooms, and drive their papers into the ground. We've also seen union-busting efforts like the Plain Dealer, where my wife worked all those years, which laid off all of its unionized reporters this May after more than 80 years of union membership at that paper. But those closures aren't just a heartbreaking loss for the dedicated journalism and support staff that lose their jobs. When local newspapers close, everyone suffers. Communities need local investigative reporting. You know how important that is. Local reporters know their communities better than anyone else. They hold those in power accountable, whether it's local government or city business leaders. And we know that unions are good for newspapers, their workers, and their communities. Without local papers, we also end up more divided as a country. If you're only watching cable news, all you're likely to hear is stories that press your partisan buttons. And stories about the local school levy, the sweetheart tax deal for a developer, the latest transit proposal, or any number of issues that affect families' lives every day so directly, just as much, perhaps more than the national headlines. Our democracy, our communities, our country need local newspapers. We can't afford to let this trend continue. I'm working on local news legislation that would set up a source of federal funding for local news outlets, including online outlets, to help them find financial stability. We already have a similar fund for public radio and television. By providing grants to local news sources, we can push back against the hedge fund acquisition and destruction model. It really is that acquisition and destruction model that puts papers out of business. The fund would help newspapers stay afloat, would keep the lights on so that they can continue to inform their communities. And funding would also be included to support longer-term investigative journalism that is vital to our communities and vital to a functioning democracy. It's time for us to stand up for the free press, stand up for community papers, stand up for unions, stand up for the local journalists who are vital to the fabric of cities and towns all across this great country. Thank you. I look forward to our continued work together.
That was really powerful as well. I want to bring back Evan really quickly just before we go. I know we need to wrap up, but Evan, could you tell us about that fateful day when you showed up at the mansion of Alden CEO Heath Freeman on Long Island? What happened? What brought you there? And what can you tell us about that day?
Well, actually, it all started with the efforts that that Julie and the coalition were doing. When this sort of thing happens, you know, you start to feel lost as you see workers leave and you don't really know what's going on. And the efforts and the investigating that they were doing, showing what was actually going on, who were the people behind it, starting to understand the motives behind I was having to live through the destruction of something that I love so much, was really empowering. And so I have family out on Long Island. My dad and my stepmother live out there, and we were going out for a family visit. And I had just read a piece that Julie had written in The Nation about Heath Freeman. She'd done what all reporters do. She used public records and got land records and found out that he was expanding his mansion out there. I'd already read about how Randall Smith had 9 mansions in Miami Beach, and it seemed a little ridiculous. And the more I thought about it as I was sitting in traffic on the Long Island Expressway, the more I really started to stew. And because I'm in a union, Go Philly Local 38010, I knew that I had certain protections, and I also knew that negotiating was going on right now, so or at the time. So I figured, why not go out and take a picture for social media? So my wife made me a sign that said "Invest in us or sell us," which was sort of the mantra that we were pursuing with the Guild at the time. And we drove out there. My stepmother, who is a former newspaper reporter and helped break the glass ceiling on news at the Knickerbocker News in Albany, she came with us and she took my picture. And then as I was standing there, it occurred to me, I knock on people's doors all the time for a living. Why not go and see and ask Mr. Freeman to explain what his plan is for making these newspapers sustainable? So I went and I knocked on the door, and the person who I presumed to be the housekeeper let me in. I stood there. He was standing at the top of the stairs. He just shook his head, and I was quickly ushered out the door. That was the end of it. But because of that little act of defiance, I ended up, willingly or not, becoming the poster boy for the loss of local news. And it's an important enough message that although journalists don't really like to talk about themselves, they like to report the story. They don't want to be the story. It had become increasingly obvious that our story and some of the things that Senator Brown just talked about are really vital to America. And if I had to put up with a little bit of discomfort and spotlight in order to help push that message forward, I was willing to do it.
That's great. That's super cool. So, you know, sorry. Okay. So now I think I have a question for Susanna. You know, do you feel the lawmakers and public officials, is she there? I think she's there. Okay, there we go. Do you feel that lawmakers and public officials in Illinois share your support for local news, and what would take steps to push back on hedge funds like Alden? And what do you think can be done, and how can the people tonight who are listening help?
Well, first of all, you know, I can't really speak for other electeds. I would certainly hope that they would share the same feelings and concern and urgency honestly, that I do, because, you know, it's kind of a love-hate relationship. I think we're all aware of this, right? Sometimes it's really loving and sometimes it's hateful, but it's necessary, right? It's about holding people accountable. When you shine a light on what's happening, which brings out the truth, that really creates systemic change. I mean, if we lose our local press, it's like I said earlier, we lose the fundamental bedrock of our democracy. So I certainly hope that other elected officials will stand up, will stand with you, and will, you know, introduce these, whatever changes we need to do, whether it's at a state legislative level, whether it's at the federal level. I'm certainly all ears when it comes to, if you guys have some ideas that we should be entertaining in Illinois that could help the situation right here, right now, I'm all ears. I know 118 legislators in the House and 59 senators, right? And we can get stuff done. But the key thing here is that you not be afraid. You, the members of the press. I am inspired by some of the really tough statements that Chicago reporters have taken against Alden, right? Like early on when they were starting to do the buy. I mean, guys like Greg Pratt, who pull no punches back, you know? And truthfully, when I was serving as controller in the beginning with Bruce Rauner, who is in the hedge fund business, right? I have my own experience of having to not be afraid to stand up to a big bully. It's the equivalent of Alden with you guys. And we know what happens when hedge fund managers take over. They destroy. And that happened to the state of Illinois. And as controller, the person who has to manage the state's finances, I still am feeling the consequences, the pain of a guy who wanted to run Illinois like he runs his hedge funds, and that's destroying it bit by bit. So we have to stand up. We can't be afraid of the big bully. You folks keep fighting the good fight. I will do my part. I'm happy to work with you to come up with some ideas, some proposals that we could do on a state level, and to rally the support from the other elected officials that I know, I really feel in my heart would do the right thing for you all. So it's not just for you. This is for democracy, and we should all care about that.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I really do hope that kind of appetite for legislation that can help us is there, because that would be really great. And, you know, I think also, you know, Stephen's replanting strategy is pretty similar to what we've been pursuing as the Tribune Guilds with our Save Our News campaign. You know, we're really trying here to create a new media ownership model that returns control of local news to those most in need of our coverage. Our strategy basically is to pool capital from civic-minded investors in each of the Tribune markets and to take over the company that way. You know, several foundations in Baltimore, which are supported by prominent local leaders, have already pledged to do that for the Sun in Baltimore. And, you know, there are similar conversations happening wherever else Tribune operates. You know, we know it's not going to be easy here. We face an unwilling seller who's more dedicated to picking the bones of the resource-starved newspapers it owns than investing in expanding community coverage, which is what we actually need. And many of our guilds have been engaging with community leaders and representatives and, you know, working with potential investors to build these regional coalitions to help Alden find its way out of the news business. And we've collected over 10,000 signatures on petitions. And we're out in the streets and on social media talking directly with members of our communities to build solutions through informational campaigning and rallies in our downtowns. We really need the community to help us build this new kind of local news and work not just to save our papers, but to reinvigorate them.
Yeah, and the reason for this forum is to build on our successes and expand our coalition to include more people and more organizations that value local journalism. We want to ask our communities to organize forums, pledge drives, community visioning sessions to help us imagine what a new local newspaper would look like. We need elected officials to amplify the alarm bells, launch investigations, work with our guilds to develop legislation that deeply protects the journalism we value. We need investors to join us to help us to realize the future we want to see. And everywhere we go, we hear the same thing. People don't know that there is a problem. We need to work to change that by working together to take back our newspapers from hedge funds like Alden. We're excited by the prospect of breathing new life into local news, but we need your help. So after this call, go sign the Save Local News petition. The web address is below. And that way we will have your email, your phone number. We have ways to get in touch. Also, you can reach out to your representatives of your local guild at any time. We know that there might be lots of leftover questions. Please get in touch, and we intend to continue the conversation. Thanks to everyone that joined us tonight. This was a really great session.